G'day everyone, Ethan Nash from TOTTnews.com here on the 15th of November 2018, and today we're going to be examining a very important topic, and that is how the UN ended Australian sovereignty by signing us on to the first agreement of its kind, the Lima Declaration, in March of 1975. Now, over the last 40 years in Australia, we've seen our national car industry disappear, we've seen steel making continue to suffer, farming is in a crisis, and our petrol industry, it's under severe threat of being moved overseas. And it's left Australia short of technology, tools, and jobs for the modern world, and has set a foundation for the rapid decline of our nation's most important industries. It seems in the pursuit of an open world, the Lima Declaration unlocked the gates that sealed the divide between the first and the third world, allowing the line to be blurred and integrated into a worldwide plantation for exploitation. In March 1975, the Second General Conference of the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, better known as UNIDO, met in Lima, Peru during the period of the 12th to the 26th. The concept behind the declaration explored the notion that the drastic situation of the Third World was in fact a result of the policies of advanced industrial nations, Australia listed as one of these. The only way to rectify the situation, according to the agreement, was to transfer industrial resources from advanced nations such as Australia to the Third World, and then to provide markets for Third World exports by buying products once produced locally. Section 35 of the Lima Declaration sets out the intended goals of the trade deal, stating, quote, that special attention should be given to the least developed countries, which should enjoy a net transfer of resources from the developed countries in the form of technical and financial resources as well as capital goods to enable the least developed countries, in conformity with policies and plans for development, to accelerate their industrialization. The document also reads that effective control over natural resources constitute for developing countries an indispensable condition for economic and social progress. The resulting declaration would have disastrous ramifications for Australian industry. Today, the aftermath of the Lima Declaration on Australian society can primarily be felt across manufacturing and agricultural industries, much of the foundation of our country, and was a key stepping stone to what we know as free trade in the 21st century. A systematic stripping of national sovereignty under the guise of openness and progression allowed the signing of an unprecedented deal that would reinvent the way nations interact with each other in a newly emerging international community. Let's explore some of the results. Large numbers of manufacturers downsized operations or moved operations completely overseas to take advantage of lower wages and minimal environmental regulations following the signing. The Lima Declaration provided the perfect framework for cheap importation, cheap labour, and cheap costs of operation. According to the document itself, Section 52, quote, developing countries should devote particular attention to the development of basic industries such as steel, chemicals, petrochemicals, and engineering, thereby consolidating their economic independence while at the same time assuring an effective form of import substitution and greater share of world trade. Here in Australia, fashion retailer Fletcher Jones famously openly declared that globalisation was to blame for their company closing operations in Mount Gambier and moving offshore. For states such as South Australia, which at one time had a third of its workforce employed in manufacturing, the blueprint was now set for the transfer of wealth and productivity to the Third World. Today, South Australia faces an unprecedented employment and infrastructure trouble, as companies have abandoned the ship and the remnants of a once prosperous state have become sites of economic ruin. Examples such as the Holden plant closure, a plant that manufactured over 7.5 million cars for domestic and export use over a 70-year period, now stands like a ghost over Elizabeth. Australia's power generation crisis, including the sudden and unexpected closure of coal plants at Hazelwood in Victoria and Port Augusta in South Australia last year, are putting enormous pressure on power supplies, and these are only a few examples of the lasting effects of the Lima Declaration just 40 years later. Building, infrastructure, the list goes on and on. In our piece on tottnews.com, The Foreign Takeover of Australian Gas and Electricity, we explore how only 3 out of 8 state governments currently retain ownership of their electricity markets in Australia. That is, generation, distribution, transmission and retail operations. Only 3 out of 8. Companies that have taken control of the infrastructure include Hong Kong's CKI and State Grid Corporation. There are only so many tariffs and trade conditions one can reduce before a country finds itself personally disadvantaged. Australia is now starting to realise this. Farming in Australia is compiled of 1.6 million jobs in the complete farming supply chain and contributes $155 billion to GDP annually, 60 billion of that from agriculture alone. It also creates wealth that is redistributed within Australia, as opposed to mining profits, which are mostly exported by multinationals that pay little, if any, tax at all. However, despite agriculture and farming being the backbone of Australian economic and collective spirit, the Lima Declaration and agreements since have led to unscrupulous pressure tactics to force local producers to match the price of imported goods, while our land and resources are taken away at a rapid pace right before our eyes. The Lima Declaration forced developing nations to incorporate the following. 59B. Quote, adoption of trade measures designed to ensure increased exports of manufactured and semi-manufactured products, including processed agricultural products, from the developing to the developing countries. Since 1975, newly formed agricultural bodies have continued to be enthusiastic supporters of tariff reductions in other countries in exchange for the elimination of local tariffs on our produce. In fact, according to the Lima Declaration 41, quote, developed countries should adhere strictly to the principle that preference systems must not be used as an instrument for economic and political pressure to hamper the activities of those developing countries which produced raw materials. In fact, protection measures such as quarantine are deemed a form of, quote, unfair protectionism in the agreement and contravene the, quote, spirit of free trade. This has led to the importation of poor quality goods from the third world and the current agricultural crisis in Australia. In our piece on tottnews.com, the Australian government doesn't care about our farmers. We explore how Australia and China have a particular basis for long-term agricultural cooperation, aka extortion, with over 13.6% of all Australian agriculture foreign-owned in 2018, including 17 million hectares of land in Queensland alone and 14% of all farms across the country. Those who have been watching these developments have every right to be alarmed at the real ramifications of the Lima Agreement and all subsequent international agreements. As a growing shift in culture has seen a rejection of much of the propagated materialistic society, our New Age internationalists have repackaged the aims of the Lima Agreement into a new endeavour based on collective responsibility for crimes against the planet. A recent example of this can be found in the Paris summit to address the issue of climate change, where faceless representatives met behind closed doors and then emerged triumphantly to declare an agreement had been reached, along with the promise that the developed world would pay the poor nations $100 billion per year. Yet again, developed nations are seeing reparations for being successful, industrious, and organised. As such a handsome sum is channeled annually to the developing world, along with lowered border restrictions and an unfettered flow of capital out of the West, one can be forgiven for wondering where it will end. Indeed, many of the hundreds of international treaties now signed by governments on our behalf are driven by the United Nations, a body that no Australian has approved by voting in a referendum to allow them to have a say in how we are governed or how we conduct our national affairs. The most recent example is the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which Australia has recently ratified and will come into effect on December 30, 2018. In this agreement, foreign corporations will be able to use what are called investor-state dispute settlements, or ISDS, and their tribunals to allow companies to sue governments in industries like environment, health, labour, safety laws and regulations, and so on. And if the government introduces laws that prevent a company from making a profit, they can be sued. A slippery slope indeed, one that started with the Lima Declaration in 1975. The Lima Declaration is nothing more than an economic death warrant by the UN. The question those of us in the West must ask ourselves is, how much are we prepared to give, particularly at the cost of the future for our own children? To learn more, head over to tottnews.com and make sure to follow us on social media for more exclusive content and discussions, and make sure to subscribe for free to tottnews.com. Thank you for watching, and until next time, you take care of yourselves.